Public-private partnerships. How can PPPs deliver better services? The basics of PPPs.
Hi, my name is Michael Klein. Over the last 30 years, I've worked on and off on public-private partnerships at the World Bank, in the private sector, and now teaching about it at the university. And I'll talk a little bit about the big picture of public-private partnerships. In fact, there's a lot of interest today about these topics, but the term public-private partnerships is relatively new. It came up in the 1990s, whereas the phenomenon itself, the collaborative arrangements between public and private sector for the purposes of providing infrastructure, is actually quite old. For example, in Thailand and Japan, the first railways were built as PPPs, as we would say today, or as concessions as they were called at the time. And we've also seen cycles in history between public and private ownership forms in infrastructure. Everything started in most countries private, and then there was nationalizations in various forms and shapes over the history of infrastructure provision. One of the earliest examples is a very famous one. In 1778 in Paris, the brothers Perrier built the first urban pipeline system for water supply in this city. And then shortly thereafter, the French Revolution happened in 1789, and they were nationalized after that. So here's an example of an early cycle between private and public provision. We have renewed popularity of PPPs. That was roughly since the 1980s. Lots of countries are looking at them. We know that there have been at least 6,100 PPPs in infrastructure since the early 90s in emerging markets, mobilizing a total of over $2.2 trillion. In just about any country in the world, with the big ones, Brazil, China, India, Nigeria, Turkey, Russia, and so on, all being major players in this area at different times and in different sectors. The question then is, what is a PPP? And some people like to provide a particular definition and find a bright line between what is public, what is pure private, and what is a PPP in between. In fact, PPPs are best thought of as being on a continuum of ownership options from pure public to pure private. And there really isn't a bright line that one can draw anywhere. To give examples, when you have a public sector road, the road construction is typically done by a private company. Some governments, after having the road constructed by a private company, then go on and give the maintenance contract to another private company, or sometimes even to the same private company. So is that a PPP or is it government ownership? We can construct any type of arrangement that gets as close to PPP or to private or public as we want. What's really important to think about is not so much what line to draw between public and private and PPP and whatever else, but to think about the basic building blocks for PPPs. And I would put it that there are 4 key design questions one needs to keep in mind. The first one is to see which sector do we want to contract out in. Is it in energy, in water, in transport? Which subsector is it? Is it ports, airports, roads, power plants, or distribution systems, water treatment plants, or the whole water supply? These are one set of questions. The second one would be, what function do we want to delegate to the private sector? Is it construction? Is it operations? Is it both? Is it rehabilitation? Is it maintenance? Is it just the management? There again, we have a whole series of options. And then comes the biggie, namely who pays for the whole thing. And in infrastructure, typically there are only 2 people who can pay for this. It's either the consumer or the taxpayer. And so decisions have to be made about pricing levels. Will there be enough cash flow from consumer fees to cover the costs of the project, or do we need the taxpayer to step in as well? And finally comes the financing question. And I want to emphasize the difference between payment, who pays for the service, and financing. Once the basic system is in place, payment is assured, cash flow is there, financing is relatively easy. The financing decision then is about how much equity, how much debt, what type of debt, how, et cetera, et cetera. That's the 4th set of design questions. So with this perspective on PPPs, then the question remains, okay, fine. So there are PPPs, but why should we bother? What are the arguments to actually go into a PPP? The rationale often is put as, we want the best of both worlds. Government funding, they say, is cheap, cheaper than the private sector funding. The private sector is, on the other hand, more efficient than the public sector in providing a service. And so we put these two things together, cheap finance with greater efficiency, and we get the best of both worlds in form of a PPP. First, government can borrow more cheaply. Well, yes, we know that in most cases, creditworthy sovereigns can borrow at lower rates than private sector companies from the same jurisdiction. And then the question is, why is that so? Is that because governments manage risks better? Well, maybe not. The real reason is that if things go wrong in a government project that is funded with a government sovereign debt, the taxpayers are called upon to make the creditors whole. So the taxpayers de facto provide unremunerated credit insurance in this case. And once we start valuing the risk that is borne by the taxpayers, it's no longer clear that government money is actually cheaper than private money. And so that is not a rationale that holds up systematically. Second part of the best of both worlds story is that the private sector is more efficient. Well, we have lots of acquaintances, all of us. Some work in the public sector, some in the private sector. Are they systematically the better people in the private sector, the more efficient ones, and the not so efficient ones in the public sector? I wouldn't say so. I think the real issue is what are the incentive systems, the government's frameworks that operate in these different types of enterprises and operational areas. So in the private sector, you typically have more performance contracts, stronger incentive systems, and that's what leads to efficiency improvements. In principle, governments can mimic a lot of these incentive systems. Performance contracts that we see in PPPs, for example, can all be introduced also in government companies and have been, and there's a case for every type that we could imagine. PPPs can be superior when the private sector companies that are in there have an interest in maintaining good reputation, and when the governments contract and oversee the PPP well. And this is a difficult act for some governments. On the one hand, PPPs make sense because they can help avoid some of the problems in government, but governments still have to be good enough to contract and oversee the PPP well. To sum up, if you want to improve access and service and infrastructure delivery at a lower cost, etc., we need change and better incentives to perform. And PPPs are a useful tool, but they're no miracle cure. Now, would you only take a medicine if it's a miracle cure? Probably that wouldn't leave you with very much. So it is a useful tool. It can improve. It is systematically slightly better than government performance based on the evaluations that we have, and it can actually stimulate improvements amongst government firms. So it's really a useful tool to take a look at.
This has been an Open Learning Campus presentation brought to you by the World Bank Group, accelerating solutions through learning.